We go live. Welcome to this webinar organized by the Sovereign Debt Forum on how to manage the coming sovereign debt crisis. Before I introduce and give the floor to our distinguished panelists, let me say a few words about the Sovereign Debt Forum. The Forum, or SDF, is the result of a collaboration between the Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London and the Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown University. It was launched at the IMF in Washington, D.C. in October 2019. Since then, the European University Institute in Florence has also become a member. Our forum, the Sovereign Debt Forum, which is the host of our seminar today, is the brainchild of Lee Buchheit, and it serves as an interdisciplinary research hub and a platform for capacity building, policy development, and research dissemination programs. The forum's capacity building work focuses on low and middle income countries at risk of sovereign debt distress, as well as countries that have recently gained market access and have limited debt management experience. Let me just say a couple of words about both the Center and the Institute. The Center for Commercial Law Studies, which celebrates this year in 2020 its 40th anniversary, was established by Professor Sir Roy Good in June 1980. It was actually June, the month of June, to create an environment where practicing commercial lawyers and those from academia, as well as from civil society and policy circles, could meet and exchange ideas. The Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown was founded by John Jackson in 1999 as a focal point for research and debate in issues of trade policy, international tax, monetary affairs, and financial regulation. It has been a privilege for many of us, certainly for me, to have worked both with the late John Jackson and with Sir Roy Good here in London. Officials from the Africa Legal Support Facility, the Central Bank of Ghana, the IMF Legal Department, Her Majesty Treasury in the UK, the Ministry of Finance in the Netherlands, the German Ministry of Finance, the Paris Club Secretariat, and the US Treasury Department are part of the consultative group for our Sovereign Debt Forum. A few logistical issues about this webinar before we hit it on with the panelists. We have just started and we are recording. We are not on Chatham House rules, so everything will be publicly available. And the panel in principle will last until 4:30 p.m., though may end up earlier. As moderator, I will be asking each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves so that I don't speak for all of them. And I will ask a question to each of them to open the debate. We now live in Zoomland, and all of you are familiar with the chat room feature that allows you to put questions to the panelists. So I invite all the attendees, and we have more than 800 attendees today, to put those questions to the panelists via the chat feature in the Zoom platform that we're using. I will aim to have the panelists addressed as many questions as possible during the Q&A. The subject of today has attracted a great deal of policy, economic, legal, and media attention in the context of the pandemic and its aftermath. According to the World Bank's new global economic prospects, to which actually Martin Wolf in the Financial Times was talking yesterday, COVID-19 is the most adverse peacetime shock to the global economy in a century. The IMF, on its own, both the managing director in a number of communications as well as publications in the website, has argued that emerging and developing countries, which are the focus of our seminar today, need $2.5 trillion, and that further debt relief beyond the one that was already agreed with the G20 in April is a necessity for the poorest countries and also for the many heavily indebted emerging economies. The title of our seminar, I will reiterate, How to Manage the Coming Sovereign Debt Crisis, predicts there will be a crisis, but that will be my first question because it signals a degree of uncertainty. So the first question, which is addressed to our two very distinguished economists in the panel, Jerome Settlemeyer of the IMF and Alfonso Garcia of the World Bank relates to this. Jerome and Alfonso, both the IMF and the World Bank have been rather gloomy in their forecasts and in their figures. Can you confirm or not the likelihood of this prediction? Are we going to have a systemic crisis? And how dire are the debt sustainability issues and projections? So the floor is yours if you want to unmute yourself. First, Jerome, introduce yourself, and then Alfonso Garcia Mora.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. So to all viewers, it should be amply clear that Alfonso and here are the warm-up act, right? Before the real stars get the stage. And so, you know, what I'm hoping is a dignified warm-up act. Now, we did coordinate a little bit. So I will give you sort of a little bit of a big picture answer to Rosa's question, and then Alfonso will speak a bit more about, if you like, the perspective of this specific year. So to start with a sort of very big picture, we are at the end of a debt cycle that started after the global financial crisis in the early 2010s. And we have been here in this situation many times since the beginning of modern finance in the early 19th century. So we have had about 8 to 10, depending on how you count it, what I would call center periphery debt cycles since about 1820, since the formerly Spanish colonies in Latin America gained independence. And so it's always the same pattern. You have regions of the world economy. It used to be Europe for a long time, then North America joined. Now new creditors such as China are joining that produce excess savings. They export these savings to emerging markets and developing countries. Then the debt cycle matures and there's a series of busts, and these busts typically involve defaults and sovereign debt restructurings. We have had 4 such cycles since World War II. The 1870s, early 80s cycle, mainly to Latin America and some African countries, 1990 to 97, emerging markets, both in Asia and in Latin America, and also in emerging Europe. Then, importantly, and easy to forget, we have had the Euro area center periphery cycle, which was a classic emerging market boom-bust cycle from 2000 to 2009. And then we have had a new cycle to emerging markets and developing economies that started around 2010 and arguably ended last year, even before the COVID crisis, or was ending. And as I said, all these cycles have ended with deep debt restructurings and sometimes very messy defaults. Now, to get to Rosa's main question, how bad is the current situation? Well, it's pretty bad. And the reason why it's pretty bad is because this was an exceptionally large cycle just in terms of the volumes of flows, and because it reached a large part of the world economy, not just what you might call the traditional emerging market countries, right, the Argentinas of the world, but also a whole lot of new borrowers, predominantly in Africa, not only in Africa. And so, as I said, this cycle was coming to an end even before the COVID crisis. And so to give you an illustration of that, we had about, if you count it, there are about roughly 12 to 15 countries that were in deep debt crisis or default situations with restructurings announced for the most part, even before COVID hit, right? So these are, of course, Argentina, Lebanon, Venezuela. We have had a few countries that have arrears for many years. We have had countries like Zambia, Republic of Congo that have been in deep debt trouble for some time before COVID. Another illustration is the fact that we, in a very timely move, of course we didn't know about it, our institutions, so the World Bank and the IMF, published a paper in February 2020 entitled Debt Vulnerabilities in Low-Income Countries, where we found that about half of the countries that were surveyed there, and there were about 70 countries, were at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. So that's roughly 36 countries. And so, you know, this is all pre-COVID. Now, not all of these 36 countries obviously would have required a restructuring. You know, this included the high risk of debt distress countries, but, you know, the proportion that may require it is going to be larger as a result of the COVID shock. So in some sense, that those numbers set a lower bound to what might happen. So it will be a pretty bad debt crisis. I'm not sure whether it will be as bad as the previous high watermark, which was the great debt crisis of the 1980s, but it could end up in that territory. The question is, can the system handle it? And so let me just quickly remind you of what the system is. The system is, in effect, since we do not have, you know, a statutory insolvency regime for sovereign debt, the system is sort of a collection of institutions and procedures and contracts. And so roughly there are four components. There's debt exchange offers that refer mostly to bonds, and they have been used very successfully since the mid-1990s. There is collective action clauses that can support these bond exchange offers. And those, if anything, have improved over the last 5 years because of the addition of so-called one limb, enhanced collective action clauses, which the lawyers here know more about than I. There's very importantly the Paris Club as the institution coordinating official creditors. And of course, there's my own institution, the IMF, which provides financing during and immediately after debt restructuring, provides a commitment device that helps debtors reform, and this can be an important component of, in a sense, a plan to resolve the debt crisis. And finally, we try to outline the envelope of required debt relief without taking sides, and that is a very difficult endeavor, but we nonetheless try to do that. And so, you know, the answer is, I mean, it's a pretty resilient, strong system. It's been historically built up over time. It has seen many debt crises. And yes, so the system will work to some extent. But of course, it was imperfect even before the crisis. And there are a few things that make you sort of worry slightly. So there are some complications that have arisen, which in my view imply that you know, the system may have trouble with some situations. And so let me just sort of restate the fact: we have many inexperienced debtors, new debtors with institutional capacity constraint. Whenever you have that, there is sort of this tendency to procrastinate even more than with experienced debtor. We have a new creditor landscape. So we have the traditional asset managers, we have banks like we always used to have, but we always also have commodity traders, for example, that are important private creditors. And as I think mentioned already, we have official creditors outside the Paris Club. So they're outside this, you know, very well-tested coordination structure. And those creditors now hold the majority of official bilateral claims. And, you know, for all these reasons, it ain't going to be easy, which is why, you know, we need the seminar, because today we're going to get the solutions. Thanks, Rosa.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for both the historical introduction, which was very enlightening, as well as for a description of the resilience of the system, the pre-COVID problems, and the acceleration of those problems post-COVID. And Alfonso García Mora is going to further explain in some detail what some of those problems post-COVID are. So thank you, Jeremy, again, for those that have just joined of the IMF, and now Alfonso García Mora of the World Bank. Thank you. You can unmute yourself and start talking.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting the World Bank and myself to this great panel. And before going to the solutions, as Jeremy said, I'm really looking forward to hear the panelists of this great event. Let me elaborate a little bit more on this initial picture of what is the situation and how likely a potential debt crisis could be. I think that Jeremy has has done a very good analysis of how we enter into this COVID crisis, which I think is fundamental, because in a way, what we are talking today is not just the consequence of the COVID-19 impact. It is also the consequence of something that came from before. And just to give you an example, we published at the World Bank this book on the 4 waves of debt. And it was published actually in January. Before, I mean, COVID-19 was already in China, but we didn't know that it was going to be something systemic, and even less when we actually wrote that book. And we made reference in this book to the 4 waves that Jeremy was mentioning, and that we were at the end of this 4th wave that was somehow quite different from the other 3 because of its systemic role. So basically, it affects many countries, much more than before, because of the rapid and extended accumulation of debt in emerging markets, and because of what Jeremy has said, the typology of creditors is very different from what we had in the other 3 waves, which makes any potential resolution much more difficult probably, or at least different than what we had before. So this is how we entered, or how we came here. No? And now we have the COVID-19 that actually has taken us to a totally different and more worrisome dimension. You were mentioning, Rosa, that yesterday we published the GEP, the Global Economics Prospect, where we forecast that the global economy will shrink by more than 5% this year. This is the deepest recession since the Second World War, and this is a real systemic depression. So I don't think that we have seen anything like that ever. Basically, as Martin Wolf was highlighting in his article, this is the year where the largest number of economies will experience a decline in the income per capita since 1870. So basically, ever. We have never seen something like that. No? And this, I think, is critical to go or to answer your question, because I think that one of the key things of this crisis is the systemic role of this crisis. Is that this is not just a Latin American crisis or a high-tech crisis or a European Union crisis. This is something that can really go across regions, which makes the resolution or potential solutions much more difficult than in other circumstances. I also think that it is important to see, as I was mentioning before, how we enter into this crisis, because there are some factors or there are some issues that are common to every country because of this systemic role, whereas there are others that will be idiosyncratic to some specific countries, which is what we are used to solve. Let me go first to those factors that are common or to all of them. So since the global financial crisis, we know that the global debt has risen to more than 200% of GDP, 170% in emerging markets and developing economies. And actually, emerging markets and developing economies, the government debt is now at least 20 percentage points higher than it was before the global financial crisis. And as Jeremy was saying, this is a concern because many of these countries probably didn't have the institutional capacity or were not prepared to manage the accumulation of debt that has actually taken place. And if it is already, or these numbers are already big and somehow impressive, we still don't know what is the amount of debt that has been or is being accumulated as we talk due to the response to the COVID-19. So there are many contingent liabilities that governments are taking, which cannot be otherwise probably. There are many actions related to health response, related to social protection response, related to economic response that many countries are taking, and it is not easy to incorporate these numbers yet into our predictions. So this will also be an important factor that will even increase even more the situation or the numbers that I mentioned before. And probably because of that, what we are seeing is a significant response from the rating agencies, and we have seen already more than 50 countries or sovereigns where the rating has been downgraded, which is a very large number, probably the largest number in such a short period of time in history, and might make sense, but we also know that these rating actions may have some pro-cyclical effect. and therefore countries that are whose ratings is revised downwards may have more difficulties, and it will create even more revisions, and it will create even more difficulties. So I'm saying that because I think that this is very important to see how this crisis or this situation can unfold going forward. And just to give us a sense of where we are, there are more than 30 emerging markets with ratings lower than B. Well, 30 countries with ratings lower than B. I don't know if it is a systemic crisis, if it is an idiosyncratic crisis, but this is something serious. Because this has just started, as I said, and there are another 58 countries where the rating has been downgraded. And my last point is, will this affect every country then, Alfonso? I mean, given this scenario that you are describing, well, I think that those countries with good fundamentals will probably continue having, and will likely have access to markets without any problem, because we see that the injection of liquidity and the action of central banks, multilateral institutions, etc., that have taken place is huge, is historical as well. $4 trillion in liquidity injected by the central banks in 1 month. This has never happened in the past. And this will create, of course, enough liquidity to make sure that those countries with good fundamentals will not probably have problems in continue having access to markets, no? At least in the short term. But there are two pieces that I think are important to follow. One is the exposure to debt-related risks, both external and internal, related to corporate capital outflows from emerging markets, rollover risks, currency pressures, and deteriorating growth prospects. And one that, in my opinion, is critical, which is the bank and sovereign nexus. This is going to be fundamental in the future. Basically, because we know that most of the sovereign debt is precisely in the banks, in the commercial banks of these countries, and we know that the deterioration of assets that we are seeing across the board in the corporate side, in the private sector, will have an impact on NPLs. This will probably have an impact on the banking sector, and this might have an impact on the sovereign. So here there is a transmission channel that we also need to keep in mind when thinking on the likelihood of a crisis like this one. But the second one, or I would say the positive piece, is the resilience to macro-fiscal shocks. No? And there are countries that are well prepared, have done their homework in terms of flexibility of exchange rate regimes, reserves, fiscal buffers, financial sector soundness, etc., and therefore might be able and will probably and will undoubtedly be able to manage this situation. So I would categorize, and I will finish with that, 3 types of countries. Those where the debt was already unsustainable before we enter into COVID-19, and these are the countries that, some of the countries that Jeremy was mentioning. Second, those countries that have faced or have suffered an increase in the level of vulnerabilities in some sense or also due to COVID-19 impact, and this will require support, and is quite uncertain at this point in time to what extent we will be or something more relevant will be needed. And those countries with limited vulnerabilities, but that could be affected by a shift in market sentiment. That we see how the market sentiment has changed in just 1 month or 2 months. So these countries are initially less vulnerable, but also potentially affected by this shift in market sentiment. So all this take us to this situation of, yes, there are some countries that are already there. There are other countries that are in an uncertain territory, but of course the scenario that we will have in terms of economic prospects and financial scenarios is quite uncertain at this time and difficult to end up with a full conclusion if it is a systemic crisis, what will come, or it will be more idiosyncratic as is already happening. No? So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Alfonso and Jeremy, for this very enlightening economic introduction to some of the very dire problems that many countries have, some of them predating COVID and some of them post-COVID. In any case, COVID has accentuated the problems for the countries that also had that problems before COVID. And so the situation perhaps does not look very optimistic going forward. And we can come back to some of the issues that you both mentioned in the Q&A, you know, from the vicious link between banks and sovereigns and the rise in non-performing loans, which will be a major issue, to the resilience in countries that do not have the programs of fiscal and monetary support that we have had in the US and the European Union and the UK. But before we go to the full Q&A, I said at the beginning when I introduced the webinar that I will be posting a question to each of you individually. And the next question is to Lee Buchheit, who is known to all of you as the world's leading authority on sovereign debt, and who is now a visiting professor at Queen Mary University of London, as well as the University of Edinburgh, and a few others. And Lee, I would like to pose a question that to some extent relates to the historical aspect that Jeremy already mentioned, but goes a bit farther. So how would, I like to put emphasis on the conditional, how would a systemic sovereign debt crisis in the 2020s, and again, Alfonso said, we do not know yet if it will be systemic or idiosyncratic. In any case, we know it will be a crisis of some sort. But how would a systemic sovereign debt crisis in the 2020s compare with similar crises in the past? And in particular, we have not had a truly systemic sovereign debt crisis. And again, this is something that Jeremy alluded to since the 1980s, the famous lost decade, década perdida in Latin America, but as well as other parts of the world. And can you describe, Lee, the conditions that could give, and again, conditional, could give rise to such crisis, comparing and contrasting the differences between the 1980s and the 2020s?
Thank you, Rosa, and welcome to everyone on this extraordinary webinar. In answer to your question, Rosa, we haven't really had a systemic debt crisis since the 1980s. We have had localized sovereign debt problems, the East Asian crisis in the late 1990s, Russia, of course, in 1997, 98, the Caribbean in the early 2000s. We've had localized sovereign debt problems, but we haven't had a truly contagious sovereign debt problem. What causes a systemic crisis, I think, is an event or a condition that affects multiple countries more or less simultaneously. In the 1980s, that event was a precipitous rise in the London interbank offered rate, LIBOR. What had happened was, starting in the mid-1970s, you had anywhere between 27 or 29 countries that had borrowed extensively from commercial banks on a floating interest rate basis, borrowed foreign currency, mostly US dollars, on a floating rate basis, that is LIBOR, the London interbank offered rate. By the end of the 1970s, inflation in the United States had reached double digits, and that induced the Federal Reserve to raise US interest rates a lot, not these anemic 25 basis point increases that we see sometimes, but US interest rates were elevated very fast and very substantially, to the point that by 1981, LIBOR had topped out at 22% per annum. Now, that rendered the debt stocks of most of these countries visibly unsustainable, and that catapulted everyone into the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. There are and will be material differences between how the Latin American debt crisis was addressed 40 years ago, more or less, and how a similar crisis would play out in the 2020s. The first thing to realize is that the creditor universe is very different. In the 1980s, the affected creditors were commercial banks active in international lending. While there were perhaps 500 or 600 institutions that fell into that category, it was a finite number, And they were easily identifiable. They all sat rather uncomfortably on the receiving end of a telex machine. Moreover, because the crisis threatened the stability of the international banking system, it was a matter of acute concern to the governments of developed countries who could not view with equanimity the prospect that their major financial institutions could be rendered insolvent. That had the effect of ensuring that the governments of the developed countries remained very much involved with the management of the crisis and used their influence, put it that way, on both sides of the negotiating table to ensure that the process kept moving forward. They had geopolitical influence over the debtor countries, but they had regulatory influence over the banks that were caught up in the process. And they used that leverage very effectively. The larger banks very quickly formed themselves into negotiating committees in the 1980s. They were called in this hemisphere bank advisory committees. The European version was steering committees. Mexico was the flagship restructurer in that era, having announced a moratorium on its external debt in August of 1982. And the techniques developed to deal with Mexico's situation turned out to be a template that the other countries, 27, 29, depending on how you count, managed to replicate in their own debt workouts of that era. But these were short-term debt restructurings, debt reschedulings, actually, to be more precise about it. No one in that era wished to acknowledge that the crisis could go on for very long. And so it resulted in a serial debt rescheduling throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s for many of these countries. Mexico did it 3 times, Brazil, I believe, 4 times. On the official creditor side, the official bilateral creditor side in that era, the Paris Club group of countries handled that. The Paris Club is an institution, was in those days of OECD countries that since 1956 had renegotiated their credits to emerging market sovereigns jointly under the auspices of the Paris Club. Of the French Treasury. You ask, how will it compare with the 2020s? The answer, I think, is there is bad news and there is good news. The bad news, as Alfonso said, is that we are talking about debt stocks that are unprecedentedly high in most of these countries, both in nominal terms and in terms of a comparison to gross domestic product. Moreover, we're talking about a vastly more diversified creditor community. It is not a group of international commercial banks. It is thousands of bondholders and a variety, a welter of other types of creditors, and we have no good communications link with many of them, unlike the bank advisory committees of old. Those creditors today are not subject to the same form of suasion that the commercial banks were in the 1980s. They do not salute the Federal Reserve every morning when the sun comes up, and so they will not be able to be encouraged with the same regulatory pressure that was applied so effectively in the 1980s. And finally, on the bad news side, the truth is we don't know how bad this could be. We don't know when the pandemic abates sufficiently, and we don't know what the world economy is going to look like when it does. What will commodity prices be? What will world export markets look like? What will remittances look like? What will the balance sheets of a number of these countries look like if their tax base has withered and their exports are at a much reduced level? The answer is we just don't know all of those things. And this will not be just a sovereign debt crisis. It could easily be a corporate debt crisis. As Alfonso said, it could easily be a banking crisis in many of these countries. Now, on the good news side, some countries have learned from past experiences of debt distress and have built up reserves. They have increasingly borrowed in their own currencies, so they're not subject to exchange rate movements in the same extent that they were in the 1980s. At least insofar as commercial debt is in the form of sovereign bonds. Most of those sovereign bonds now contain collective action clauses, something that was not known in the 1980s among the commercial banks. And those collective action clauses may well facilitate sovereign debt restructurings in this era. The bondholders will be mostly mark-to-market institutions. That is, they will show the value of their sovereign portfolios as the current market value every morning. When they turn on their computers, they will feel the pain of the Republic of Ruritania. All other things being equal, that makes them more amenable to quick sovereign debt workouts. What made the lost decade of the 1980s was the fact that the commercial banks of that era could not recognize losses on their sovereign portfolios for essentially the whole decade. They were so overexposed that any recognition of widespread losses would have rendered those institutions, at least on paper, insolvent. And that was intolerable, both for the institutions and for their regulators. It is for that reason that it took a decade. And during that decade, the banks were encouraged to build up their loan loss reserve provisions, and it required Nicholas Brady, the new Secretary of the Treasury, starting in 1989 and 1990, to announce a plan, the Brady Plan, which many people view as signaling the end of the Latin American debt crisis. So the good news is we are, I think, able to move more quickly, and we need not necessarily have another lost decade. I sincerely hope we will not. What we don't know is if we have a systemic sovereign debt crisis, will we be able to develop a template for addressing these situations similar to what was done in the 1980s, similar to what was done in the Brady Initiative starting in 1990? Will we be able to develop that quickly enough? Or will each of these countries have to address its own workout in an isolated case-by-case manner? We just don't know. Rosa, I will stop there and mute myself.
Thank you very much, Lee. As always, a very enlightening presentation on what went wrong in the 1980s and then the final solution, which was to some extent a systemic solution, the template of the Bradley Plan. And then the good news and bad news with the situation in the 2020s. I could see more, I wrote down more bad news than good news, but at least always with you, there is always the glass half full, so there were at least the possibility of learning from our mistakes, if that's what we can do, and finding a solution should the situation deteriorate. My next question is to my SDF academic co-director and dear friend, Anna Gelpern, professor at Georgetown and leading world expert, not just in matters of sovereign debt, in all matters relating to financial law. And Anna, I want you to do two things. It's not two questions, it's just one question. The one thing I want you to do in addition to answering the question is if you want briefly to talk about the social media and hashtag and Twitter that we are doing with the conference today. And the question, this is the most important part of the webinar, is going a little bit into the more specific legal issues and challenges. Can you talk about the apparent confusion that surrounds the meaning of default and how to manage its consequences? And the floor is yours, both to take that point and then to answer the question, as well as you're obviously, I want this dialogue among the panelists to be interactive. So if you feel that you want to answer to any of the questions that have already been posed or any of the comments that have been made by Jeremy, Alfonso, or Lee, feel most welcome to do so. So Anna, the floor is yours.
So Rosa, first of all, thank you so much. Thanks to you, thanks to everyone who made this possible. So Marcelo and Meha and Marie at CCLS and IEL, it is a privilege to work on this project, the Forum, with my friend Rosa. We did not realize just how timely it would be. There is rather an active Twitter scrum going on around this event. Hashtag to use is SD Forum. Avoid confusion with Syrian Democratic Forces, apparently.
Anna, your voice is cracking a little bit, and so just.
Oh, that's just crankiness and misery. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, great. So use SD Forum, because otherwise you'd be tweeting about Syrian Democratic Forces, and that's a different webinar. Okay, so thank you. I am very glad to have this group here because of all the bad news and everything that, all the challenges ahead that you heard about. I mean, we all do, we keep going back to writings from the early 1980s when he pretty much saw 10 years ahead, keep wondering whether there's anything we could do to shrink that 10-year span, because that brought a whole lot to a whole lot of people. And that's why I actually want to talk about the relatively pointy-headed subject of default. So about, gosh, ages.
And we're losing you again with the voice. I don't know if you can get a microphone or get closer.
So about 1 million years ago, last September, we wrote a chapter in a book edited by Jeremy's colleagues, Ali Abbas and Alex Pianowski with Ken Rogoff, on the subject of sovereign default. And one of the things that really puzzled my co-authors and me at the time was just how incoherent and all over the map understanding of default was at the time. And I am constantly reminded of this these days when we talk about subjects like debt suspension and debt restructuring, debt rescheduling, and this word default keeps coming up like some, it sort of has a magical taboo quality to it, which has the effect of shutting off the discussion and any analysis of what the problem at hand actually is. Very often you hear phrases like, you know, we've got to avoid default, so surely we can't have default. And every so often people stick in a word like messy default or disorderly default just to be polite. Really, the D word is the scary part. And actually, default is a big and squishy concept that includes things that nobody cares about. So a contractual default would include sending some financial information 15 minutes late. Who cares? On the other hand, many things that are not default under most debt contracts, like a deep debt restructuring with collective action clauses, that's not default, that's just following your contract procedures. That's the stuff that would get you a ratings downgrade, trigger credit default swaps. So we have to be careful about what it is that people are worried about and what we can do to mitigate and sort of reduce the damage from bad things happening, from bad events coming our way. Emphasize that in no state of the universe should avoiding default at all cost a policy end, ever, right? Avoiding human misery is a policy. Avoiding death is a policy end. Maybe preserving market access, if there's a market to access, maybe a policy end. Avoiding default is a means to that end, and not always a terribly good means to that end, right? A good restructuring gets you an upgrade, not a downgrade in the end, after a brief moment in selective default. So I think that subject just doesn't get enough attention, and what happens, we get, for lack of a better word, a lazy analysis and a closing of debate. So just to be clear, default is an event that has legal and economic consequences. They may be big, they may be little, but what matters is the consequences. Moreover, some of the consequences, like a ratings downgrade, again, may or may not be important in and of themselves, probably not, right? What we care about is the consequences of a downgrade. What we might care about is the consequences of a CDS trigger, rather than the event in and of it. Similarly, haircuts, rescheduling, restructuring, none of that in and of itself. So that could be a result, it could be an outcome. It is not in and of itself necessarily, nor should it be considered default or bad. And so I think that, Rosa, I want to wrap up because there's so much discussion to be had. We need to stop fetishizing the D word and any other sort of similar interim moments, right, events, conditions, and focus on the consequences and what we do to mitigate them. So if we're worried about market access, let's look at the reputational consequences of missing a payment. Let's look at the legal consequences of missing a payment. You know, last I checked, Argentina missed a payment and there hasn't been an acceleration, and it makes a huge amount of sense. First of all, because it's a trust structure, and second of all, because it's not in anybody's interest at the moment, right? When 50 countries are downgraded, when 150 countries are downgraded, what does a downgrade mean anymore, right? So let's go beyond magic words and actually try to engage in analysis, policy around things that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And there was some, sometimes the voice was lost or became a bit weaker, but I think the key point got through. And what Anna, and this is something that we can again go back in the Q&A, was wanting to raise attention is both to the concept of default, something which in a way Lee was already referring to when he was talking about how the regulators allow the banks to continue via the loan loss provisions and accounting arrangements to actually delay the problems. So what is the, on the one hand, the meaning of default related to credit risk for nation sovereign risk, and then most importantly, what's the consequences? And indeed, when you have systemic downgrades, what are the consequences of that? What is the consequences of a mispayment? You know, what should is the do, what, you know, and have a debate on this notion, which is so fundamental because it's actually the event of default what triggers often the crisis. So with thanks to Anna, my next question is to Mitu Gulati. Mitu again is a renowned scholar in sovereign debt, someone that both at an academic level and at a policy level has contributed greatly in many of his writings, also with Lee Buchheit. And what, you know, going back a little bit to the market behavior, which sometimes seems rather irrational in recent days, Mitu, can you talk about the market behavior in the wake of the pandemic? It is clear that markets will always be part of the solution. And so, but the erratic behavior and the perception that somehow that there is a disconnection between the gains in the equity market, though there was a correction as of yesterday, and the situation that we are just describing. But can you talk about the market behavior in the wake of the pandemic? So Mitu, if you hear me, the floor is all yours. And again, thanks very much as to all the panelists for being with us today and for being also a founding member of the Sovereign Debt Forum. Mitu.
Thank you, Rosa, and thanks to everyone else. This is very interesting and educational for me. I'm mostly going to ask some questions inspired by Jeremy and Alfonso primarily. So forgive me for not having deep insights, but instead just having questions. So I've been following the market behavior in terms of funding emerging market countries in particular, and have been very puzzled by the fact that even though we seem to be in the midst of one of the worst crises any of us have ever seen, the markets after an initial hiccup seem to be eagerly funding all sorts of countries that you would not think would receive funding. So Alfonso made the very valid point early in his remarks that what you would expect is that the countries that are dealing with the COVID-19 crisis better, that show better economic fundamentals, would get funding, and the ones who are doing a terrible job would not get funding, or at least would have to pay higher rates. So with apologies to Rosa and any other of my Brazilian friends, Brazil just raised something around $4 billion a couple of days ago. And I think it's not controversial to say that they're doing one of their response to COVID-19 is among the worst on the globe, yet their borrowing costs seem to go down. And because I have very little to do these days, I spend a lot of time reading disclosure statements and risk disclosures. And in the Brazilian prospectuses, their disclosures are just unbelievably useless. I mean, all they say is COVID-19 might cause a global downturn, and we are working hard to rescue. I mean, it's basically cut and pasted from all the other disclosure statements being made. So what I was taught in my economics classes is when you have situations like this, the market will begin to demand better information and will discipline those borrowers who behave badly, who do not take proper steps. And that doesn't seem to be happening. So question is why, and I hope we'll get back to Alfonso and Jeremy, but you know, there are a variety of explanations that people have put out there, and none of them make any sense to me. So the standard explanation, the first one that people give is QE. There's just so much money sloshing around. Well, but in finance, the fact that there's so much money sloshing around should not mean that everybody gets it. It should mean that it should go to the places that are better able to invest that money. That doesn't seem to be happening. Another theory is, well, just investors are very bored, so they'll invest in anything. That just sounds terrible from all theoretical perspectives. Yet another theory is that the official sector, meaning Jeremy and Alfonso, will just give everybody the money after they default. That seems unlikely if we're going to have a global crisis. And then finally, maybe if we read the contracts carefully, what we'll find out is that the borrowers and the lenders have negotiated special terms which will now enable them to recover better when this systemic crisis finally blows up on all of us. Well, if you look at their terms, they are not anticipating the crisis at all. In fact, to go back to the Brazilian terms, they do have some contingency planning, but Brazil's contingency planning is for them to be able to repurchase their bonds in the event that their economy grows at a spectacularly high rate. So it's not contingency planning for things going really badly, as they seem to be. It's contingency planning for them finding, you know, vast new reserves of gold or oil or something like that. So all of this is to say, not only is the current state of the markets puzzling, but it seems that it is taking us in a direction of a much worse crash than we would otherwise have. Now, finally, maybe from the perspective of the countries, they should just borrow as much as they can. If the markets are going to be idiotic and just throw money at them, why not take it? But from a global perspective, this doesn't seem to be going in the right direction at all. But I hope my economist friends will correct me.
I think before I go to Sean, and just for keeping the dialogue flowing, I will just go back briefly to Alfonso and Jeremy just on these questions of Mitu, because rather than answering the question, he has posed back the questions to you both. And if you want just briefly to add anything about the questions that Mitu posed, you're very welcome to do so now. And then after that, I will pose the question to Sean. So I give the floor just briefly to you, Alfonso and Jeremy.
Alfonso, you go first. No, Alfonso worked in the market, so he should go first.
Alfonso, you go first.
Okay, thank you, Rosa. Me too. I think that these are great points, and it is true that what we have seen in the last 2 weeks has been a little bit surprising in a way, especially given the $100 billion that went out of emerging markets during the March in March. But I think that I wouldn't say that markets have come back to pre-COVID situation. I think that markets are still discriminating, and not all borrowers have been able to come back to markets. There are some of them that have, and Brazil is one of them. But it is also true that Brazil has come back with an issuance that is with not with the same conditions, especially in terms of maturity than they used to do before COVID-19. But in any case, I think that the market is discriminating in a way, and little by little, some countries are being able to come back. Probably those countries that were in that uncertain bucket that I mentioned when I said there are 3 buckets of countries that we should keep in mind when thinking on debt sustainability and potential crisis. And probably those that are in this uncertain bucket, the one in the middle, are the ones that some of them are able to come back to markets these days. And to me, or for me, the main reason, one is the liquidity, and I think that this is a valid and very important point. As I mentioned before, it has been more than $4 trillion that has been injected in the markets. And we see that interest rates are super low in all advanced economies, negative rates in many countries, and with very low yields in others. So it is, in a way, normal, in my opinion, that investors start trying to searching for yield, no? as we have been saying in the past. That this will apply and will be extended to all countries, I doubt it. I don't think so. I think that there will be more discrimination and more heterogeneity on the behavior of markets and market sentiment. But that that the situation is better because the injection of liquidity and the capacity of investors to discriminate what type of risk they are able to get and not will happen, I think it is. Brazil is a case that you mentioned, Mitu, but we have Egypt as well. Egypt came back to markets a couple of weeks ago with a very impressive issuance. Again, I think that probably the market is discriminating and is buying some names that they think are more sustainable, even if things go worse than they are today. No? But I think that this is a question also to ask more to market makers, no? that probably will have more capacity to go into the insights. Jeremy, back to you.
So I agree with that. So to repeat, you know, I don't think markets are crazier than usual. Circumstances are different, and 2 ways in which they're different is liquidity injections in advanced markets, which is the point that Alfonso mentioned, and you also had mentioned, me too. The other one is that the short run is just exceptionally noisy, right? Because of uncertainty about who is going to get hit to what extent, for how long, when the recovery will start. And so that makes the market reaction also noisy. But in one respect, though, Mitu, I think, you know, markets are actually pretty reasonable, namely in not to overreact to bad policies during the crisis, right? I mean, your puzzle was, why do markets not punish countries with bad policy? Well, the answer is actually they shouldn't, because they should look past this crisis in a debt sustainability sense. I mean, they should a bit, but the important thing is ability to repay over the next 10 years or so. And so markets are looking beyond the current policymakers that you criticized, Mitu, and looking at sort of the fundamental prospects of some of these economies going forward. That would be my sort of charitable or benevolent interpretation of what's going on.
Thank you very much, both Alfonso and Jeremy, for answering Mitu's misgivings about market behavior. And we will come back to that because that's a very important issue. But just for the flow of our webinar, my next question is to Sean Hagan, who is now professor at Georgetown. He's former general counsel of the IMF and someone with whom I have worked for very many years, since I was myself at the fund more than 25 years ago. And the question, obviously, talking to Sean, has to relate to the role of the fund and the role of international financial institutions from a legal perspective, or legal policy perspective. So Sean, what role can the international financial institutions, 2 of them, the key ones are represented here today, but in particular the IMF, an institution that you know very well, can usefully play in managing a crisis of this kind, whether it becomes a systemic crisis or just a massive idiosyncratic crisis?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Rosa. Allow me to make a very obvious point, which is that when a sovereign debtor and its creditors confront a situation of debt distress, it is normally in their collective interest to get the funds to bail them out. Now, that's obvious for creditors who want to get paid under the original terms. But it is often true with sovereign debtors. We have to remember that debt restructurings carry costs to sovereigns. It's not just their creditworthiness. As Alfonso pointed out, debt restructurings can have severe economic costs, particularly where the banking system holds a lot of the sovereign debt that's going to lose value. And because of these costs, I think it's important to underscore that the policy of the IMF is actually to avoid a debt restructuring where possible. In fact, the ideal scenario is that IMF financing, if coupled with the implementation of a strong adjustment program, will actually help a country regain market access without a restructuring. And the other benefit of that from the IMF's perspective is that it also avoids contagion. However, and this is the point that I think we have to focus on, there are circumstances where this approach, it's generally referred to as the catalytic approach, is just not feasible. And that is where the debt levels are so high that there really isn't a set of economically or politically feasible policies that will enable a country to repay its creditors in accordance with its terms. Under any scenario, any reasonable scenario, debt levels will continue to rise. So it's when that moment arises, and in the IMF parlance, it's when that is called, when debt becomes unsustainable, that actually IMF policy changes. And it actually requires that its resources can only be used to support a debt restructuring process. And at that point, actually, from the IMF's perspective, delaying a debt restructuring, which is now inevitable, is only making the situation worse for the country, not better. And remember, the country is the client here. So in light of this policy, support full repayments when debt is unsustainable or sustainable, but require restructuring where debt is unsustainable. It is often the IMF that actually determines whether and when a debt restructuring will take place. And it is also the IMF that often determines the degree of debt relief that is needed. Where the program supports a restructuring, the program will specify the limits of the fiscal adjustment and the amount of financing in the form of restructuring that creditors will need to provide. So, and I think this has been underscored by the previous speakers, making judgments about when debt is sustainable or unsustainable is difficult in the best of times. It's an art, it's not a science. But in the current environment, where there is particular uncertainty for a number of countries, and Alfonso and Jeremy have underscored this, there's uncertainty as to whether or not countries are facing a liquidity crisis where perhaps the catalytic approach might be successful, or whether or not their debt is truly unsustainable, which requires a debt restructuring. It's very difficult. So I think Alfonso identified this bucket of countries, of uncertain countries. And so the question is, what should the fund do? What should the fund and the bank do in cases where you have countries fall into this gray zone? So in an article that I co-authored with Anna Gelpern and Adnan Nazare back in early April, we suggested that the IMF make its financing conditional upon a standstill, at least for those countries. One that does not involve a significant level of net present value reduction in the debt. And we pointed out that one of the benefits of a standstill in these circumstances was that if things turned out for the better, if the optimistic scenario emerged, you would have avoided a more painful debt restructuring. If it turns out to be on the pessimistic side, you would at least have the private sector there because they would have stood still, and you would be able to use those claims as part of the restructuring process. Now, in order for that approach to work, however, the IMF would need to make it clear that debtors have no choice but to request creditors to agree to a standstill if they want IMF financing, if they're in that category. If it is purely voluntary, if it is left to sovereign debtors, many sovereigns will prefer to use IMF financing to repay creditors, so as to avoid, for example, a hit to their credit rating. So I can understand actually why, until now, the IMF has not made it a condition, because the first wave of requests have been really for, although there have been a number of requests, they've been for limited amounts of emergency financing that did not carry significant conditionality. But in the next wave, where exceptional access, exceptional financing is going to be requested, I think it would make sense for the fund to consider making this a condition for the use of its resources, at least with respect to those countries. And I think it will also, if that approach is followed, it would actually catalyze creditor participation. Creditors will have the choice of agreeing to a standstill or facing the possibility of a default, since the program would actually not support full repayments to them during this period. So in some respects, we pointed out that this is an extension of the reprofiling approach that the IMF adopted several years ago. So, Rosa, to close, I think the fund plays a central role, and I know that IMF staff have been working heroically until now, and I think that their expertise and dedication will become even more important as the crisis evolves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, both for talking about the role that the IMF could play, for talking about that very interesting proposal of having a condition of a debt standstill, something to which I would like to come back in the Q&A, the issue of debt standstill or debt relief, and some in the panel have written about it from different angles. But just to continue to give each of our panelists the occasion to speak first, the next question is to Rodrigo Olivares Caminal, a professor of financial law at CCLS, close friend and colleague for many years, an expert in sovereign debt and insolvency. And Rodrigo, as you know, comes from Argentina, though these days he's also a UK citizen. But Argentina, as we know, is again in the news, perhaps not for the right reasons. And after 9 defaults against it makes headlines. And the question to you, Rodrigo, is, both to talk about Argentina, but the generic question is, can collective action clauses, to which people have already referred to, prove to be as useful as everyone hoped they would be in eliminating or suppressing holdout behavior? And again, if you can talk to that question and then you can refer to Argentina, that would be much appreciated. The floor is yours, Rodrigo.
Rosa, thank you very much. Collective action clauses, we've been discussing them probably for quite a long time now, as they have been mainly developed and pushed forward as a result of a previous Argentine default, that one from 2002. And I was trying to avoid having to discuss Argentina, but
you cannot.
Lee kind of opened the floor when he said, countries have learned from the 80s and are better prepared. And now they have CACs. But then we have Argentina. And you're pushing me to talk about what has been happening with Argentina. And I think that discussing CACs in this context is quite topical. But let me kind of do a very quick review of what is the current status quo and what has been happening with these clauses so far. But collective action clauses, what they do is there are embedded clauses in the debt instruments that what they do is they facilitate restructurings. From the debtor side, they allow a simpler restructuring. From the creditor side, it produces a more predictable outcome. These collective action clauses have been historically included in all debt instruments that were governed by English laws in since the 1800s. And in the aftermath of the default of Argentina back in 2002, collective action clauses have been widely adopted also on debt instruments governed under New York law. Collective action clauses then have been successfully used in a couple of restructurings, and these clauses have been perfectioned over time. I mean, they have been improved, and the clauses that we developed in 2002, they were allowing to do a series by series, so one bond at a time. Then came the Uruguayan restructuring, and that's when we included the feature of aggregation. So you can do more than one series of bonds in one go until, these CACs, these are the kind of the second generation CACs, this required a double threshold, or that's how they are known also as the double limb CAC. And then in 2014, in the aftermath of the Greek crisis, or basically it was the Greek crisis with the private sector involvement of the PSI, that we encountered that this double limb can be problematic, particularly in some bond issuances with basically with a small face value, because it would be easy to build a blocking holding and obstruct meeting one of the two criteria. So in the aftermath of Greece, the public sector and the ICMA, they did a public consultation. I was involved as part of that process, working at a committee with the Bank of England, with the FMLC, and bottom line, there was a wide adoption and a very strong endorsement by market participants, multilateral organizations. Everybody embraced the use of the single limb collective action clauses. And that kind of started in 2014, and now most of the new issuances and basically some of the bonds that did not have CACs now started incorporating CACs, and then now the latest trend is to include the single limb CACs, which will facilitate a restructuring. And then that's kind of the very quick historical background of the clauses. And then we are facing now a restructuring where we have two sets of bonds, ones that were issued in 2005 and others that were issued in 2016. And basically we have two bonds with two different CACs, one of the second generation CAC, which the double limb requirement, and then the 2016 bonds with the single limb requirement. What has happened is, and this is belonging basically, Jeremy referred to this as those countries that were experiencing some difficulties pre-pandemic, pre-COVID-19, and Argentina is one of these. And basically what they did is they launched an exchange offer where basically what they are doing is they are fiddling with the CAC, and now you have a CAC, which is, you can see it as a CAC on steroids, because basically it's a collective action clause that will allow for redesignation. So basically, usually when you launch an exchange offer, you first you set the perimeter, and basically these are the bonds that are going to be restructured, and these are the majorities. But one of the features of how Argentina is structuring that restructuring is allowing for a redesignation of what is the universe. So, and I wrote about this, and I posted something on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, and then some friends and colleagues yesterday made 2 blog postings on the same issue, and basically I'm glad that basically we are all concerned about this particular aspect, which is basically by allowing this redesignation of what are the bonds that are going to be included in the restructuring. It's like having an election, and basically if you don't like the outcome of the election, you amend the constituency to make it smaller until you are elected as president. And that's pretty much what is happening here. Basically, you can keep on redesignating what is the universe of the bonds that are going to be counted until you manage to pass through a restructuring. This will not allow you to restructure all bonds, but at least it will allow you to tell a success story that some of the bonds have been restructured. And this is complemented by another feature, which is a Pac-Man technique. And I know that this sounds a little bit esoteric and probably going back to the 80s, but we started talking about the 80s earlier today. So basically, this Pac-Man feature will allow, let's picture that you have, let's say, 10 bonds, you do a restructuring, and you manage to successfully restructure 5 of them. These 5 which were, let's say, accepted the restructuring with 75% of the votes. Now you launch a second offer where you include these 5 and you offer them slightly better terms. Since they are already in a worse position, they will be willing to accept better terms. And then you add 1 or 2 of the other bonds that you did not restructure originally. Then you have to play a little bit with the numbers, but basically that will allow you to start incorporating more and more bonds in your universe. So basically, this is the Pac-Man feature that will start allowing you to start eating some of the other outstanding series. It's an intelligent and a bold move, but I think that basically this poses a serious risk to what we have out there as the restructuring architecture for sovereign debt instruments. And we need to bear in mind that the reason why these clauses were developed, why these clauses were incorporated in that instrument, was to facilitate a restructuring and to make a restructuring more predictable. And the fear that my greatest fear is whether this will not undermine the effect or the efficiency of collective action clauses in restructurings. And collective action clauses have been widely endorsed by the different private sector associations, by the IMF, by the G20. So collective action clauses were here as a solution to the problems that sovereign face, and my concern is whether this, I don't like to use, basically by pushing the boundaries in how these CACs are being used, whether it will end up undermining the whole essence of the clauses. And let's remember that these clauses were developed in the aftermath of the Argentine default in 2002, and it will be sad to be seeing Argentina being the one who will end up killing the clauses. And the other thing that I would like to highlight just very briefly is that there could be a slight different interpretation of how these clauses should be interpreted in the eyes of a court. because basically if eventually these clauses are used as they are envisaged, I will not be surprised to see creditors filing claims, and how these clauses can be interpreted under New York and English law. I mean, this, what I refer is that this right to redesignate the categories, I think that this can be interpreted differently in the eyes of New York or English courts. And this has to do with a historical divergence in the context of sovereign debt as to how courts have been interpreting exit consent, and basically whether there has been an abuse of the rights of the parties. But that's something that basically, that's something that we will have to see how that eventually plays out, and eventually if the Argentina ends up using this redesignation of what are the categories of the clauses. And let's remember that particularly on the Argentine bonds, the euro-denominated bonds are governed by English law, while the others are governed by New York law.
Okay, thank you very much, Rodrigo. And the next question of this panel before we open to the Q&A is to Mark Weidemaier, who has not been able to talk yet and is professor of law at the University of North Carolina, and again, an expert in sovereign debt. As you know, this panel is the who is who in sovereign debt. So Mark, more on not just collective action clauses, the general enforcement landscape. Can you talk about that enforcement landscape and discuss ways of managing uncooperative creditors on the assumption that collective action clauses either will not work or will not be present in many contracts? So Mark, the floor is yours.
Sure, and thank you so much, Rosa. I see that we have a lot of questions, and if Alfonso and Jeremy were the warm-up act, I'm the act that's keeping us from getting to those questions, so I'll try to keep it brief. My intent here is to sort of think about the broader question of whether in a systemic crisis, if there is one, a greater degree of attention would have to be paid to managing litigation and legal enforcement risks than was true in past crises. I think many people think of the last Argentine default and the decade plus of legal proceedings that followed that to have marked something of a turning point. And I want to think about that question a little bit and really make 2 points in connection with it and the present crisis. So the first point is that in the short to medium term, by which I mean the heart of the economic and public health response to the COVID-19 crisis, whatever that means, certainly 2020 and into 2021 and perhaps even a little bit beyond. One of the concerns I frequently hear expressed is a concern with the ability to enlist the cooperation of private creditors in a debt standstill or something like of that nature. And I want to sort of insist that we characterize that concern in the short and medium term as one of politics rather than of law. My general sense is that in that period that I'm talking about, which again, I mean the heart of the pandemic response, the chances that a tribunal in New York or in London or elsewhere would allow a creditor to use legal rights to meaningfully interfere with that response, I think is remarkably low for all kinds of reasons, some of which I'll talk about in just a second. But to that extent, we're discussing a political question about the willingness to insist on private creditor participation in the short to medium term, not a legal question. In the longer term, what I want to emphasize is that we are in something of a transitional state, sort of like the one Rodrigo alluded to with CACs, where there have been a number of developments, both contractual and otherwise, that are creating open questions that we're going to need answers to before we get a sense of how relevant the law and legal actors are going to be to resolving this crisis. So let me just quickly identify a few of them and then stop. In any systemic crisis that happens now, English courts and courts outside the United States are going to play a larger role than has been true in the past. We will probably see investor state arbitration tribunals play a larger role than was true in the past. My guess is that the introduction of English courts, doesn't change anything significantly in terms of outcomes. And I'm skeptical of the value of investor state arbitration in general in this context. But those are distinctions that are going to potentially make crisis resolution different here than in the past. The second thing I would point out is that, especially in New York, we see the increased use of trust structures. One of the part of the logic underlying the use of trust structures was the thought that those would lead to more easily administered legal disputes, and would perhaps temper some of the incentives to hold out for all kinds of reasons: the need to trigger the trustee to act, the need to negotiate indemnity with the trustee, and the need to share litigation proceeds, of course, with other people who hold bonds under that trust structure. Whether they in fact serve that purpose, I think, is going to be a difficult and important question. We have hybrid contract structures, like with Argentina, where, to the extent injunctions invoking the pari passu clause are still relevant, you have contracts that mostly track the contracts that produced the injunction in 2010, and you have contracts that disclaim that remedy. That's the situation that Argentina is in, and so the question is whether that contract divergence produces differences in outcome. My sense, I think, is that the risk of an injunction like that is significantly reduced in the present crisis and is essentially zero in the near term, but that's another complication. And then finally, I will just add that if you were to add up what we know about the ability of creditors to genuinely interfere with the trade and financial transactions of a sovereign using legal enforcement, it would be dwarfed by what we don't know. And I'll just identify one thing that we don't know that seems quite fundamental. Are the proceeds of a new bond issuance in New York, in fact, attachable? In my view, the answer to that question is unknown. There are good arguments on both sides. In the past, there has been a sort of collective agreement not to ask. Argentina could borrow enough without testing the issue for a very long time, so had no incentive to try to find out. We might, in a broad enough crisis, start to see answers to that question. And since I'm having squeaky voice, as well as maybe violated my promise to stop quickly, I'm going to stop quickly and look forward to some questions.
Thank you very much to everyone for this very interesting introduction, which has already taken 1.5 hours of our time. So it's been a very rich and to some extent deep introduction in many of the issues and challenges. I have been monitoring, with the help of some of the people that have been helping us, like Marcela and Maya, the chat room, as well as I have been receiving some emails. And the first question is to Lee and to Mitu, and in a way relates to something that has been mentioned already by some of you during your presentations, and is one of the most contentious issues, the issue of debt relief. In a paper on Born Out of Necessity, a debt standstill for COVID-19, you made an interesting proposal in order to break the current standstill, where we have the G20 having agreed a temporary debt service standstill, while the private sector has been, and you're the species of the Institute of International Finance, perhaps a bit more hesitant to agree to a generalized one. The G7, in a statement on June 3rd, referred to this process And really going forward, particularly if the crisis becomes systemic, and if one goes back to the main thrust of the Brad initiative, the idea of some sort of debt relief or debt standstill, your proposal is quite, I think, interesting. So can you talk to it? Can you talk about the private sector debt relief and where you see the situation now? And if first I ask you, you lead to talk and then me too.
Thank you, Rosa. That proposal was directed at the immediate situation. That is the situation of countries that are needing to redeploy their financial resources toward COVID-19 amelioration. The official sector, in the form of the G20 and the IMF and the World Bank, moved very quickly to propose a standstill on debt service payments for those countries that request it. They targeted it at the poorest countries, the countries that belong to the International Development Association of the World Bank, IDA. They called upon private creditors to provide comparable relief. And initially, the response of the private creditors, if one believes that the Institute of International Finance is their mouthpiece, seemed very promising. As things evolved over the next few weeks, however, I think it is fair to describe the private creditor reaction as arthritic. It is not that they rejected providing relief, it is simply that they foresaw many obstacles. It would require case-by-case negotiation. It would involve perhaps significant increases in interest rates. It would involve transactions that would have to be negotiated and documented, all of which will take time, bearing in mind that the G20 debt suspension was supposed to operate only between May the 1st of this year and the end of this year. And the concern that Mitu and I and our economist colleagues had was that too much of that time would pass before private sector creditors would be able to assist in providing relief. The concern that propelled our proposal was a concern that these countries not be put in the terrible position of having to choose either between continuing normal debt service or risking the lives of their citizens, because in many countries the health apparatus is thin even in the best of times. And the idea that they would now be faced with a new pandemic would overburden the health system, and so that they would have to decide where they would spend their money. Do they pay a coupon on a foreign currency denominated bond, or do they invest in their hospitals? We had hoped that they could be spared that terrible choice. Let me turn it over to Mitu.
Mitu, if you want to say a few comments about that and add anything that you want on the state of necessity.
So just a couple of things to add to what Lee has said. You know, we were hopeful, I think, that thanks to the G20's initiative that actually began with the heads of the IMF and the World Bank asking for debt relief till the end of 2020, that countries around the world would be provided with a significant amount of relief this year to help with their health costs. As it has turned out, and perhaps history should have taught us this idea that you would get voluntary debt relief from the private sector has once again proved unsuccessful. And those of us who went through the Greek efforts perhaps should have learned, and I certainly should have learned. Now, I don't exactly blame the private sector for saying, you know, really, the official sector should provide all of the relief, and we're happy to provide market relief when we can. And the fact that the markets seem to be providing money to some countries bolsters that argument. But I think we can learn a lesson from this. If the predictions are correct, that this health crisis is not going away. In fact, it is worsening at a very fast rate in many parts of the world. And economies are not recovering, they're tanking. That means that we're going to have lots of debt restructuring to do. And I think Jeremy articulated this very nicely at the beginning. Then maybe we should learn from the failure of this current effort for the standstill. And the next time around, maybe not think that just asking for voluntary assistance in a polite way will do diddly squat. I mean, we made a mistake, and it has failed. And countries are going to be in worse debt trouble unless there is some miraculous vaccine that appears. That doesn't seem likely to appear. So maybe the key is, let's figure out what lessons we should learn from this.
Thank you very much, Mitu and Lee. This is both a very important proposal, a very important and timely question, and something that goes to the core of what the Sovereign Debt Forum is about. And so that's the next question. The next question, which I will address to Jeremy and Alfonso, concerns the HIPC initiative. And the question I will read comes from American University. With the benefit of hindsight, how would you assess the enhanced HIPC initiative? Was it not supposed to solve the debt overhang problem of the low-income countries and prevent future debt overhangs under IMF World Bank oversight? And yet, most of them were already under debt-related stress, as per the IMF World Bank, even before the pandemic arrived. So, Jeremy, if you want to talk first, and then Alfonso about this question.
Thank you. It's a provocative question. So, debt relief or debt restructuring can never prevent sovereign countries from new borrowing and potentially over borrowing after the debt relief has been given, right? So this is the enduring lesson from 8 to 10 boom bust cycles involving debt restructuring, debt relief, and new debt problems. And it is a very well-known fact that many of the countries that receive debt relief or undergo a deep debt restructuring in one cycle are the same countries that then borrow afresh and are subject to a similar problem in another cycle. So in that sense, this is simply a fact of history. Now, was the initiative a success? So I would think it was a success, or rather, does it follow from this that the initiative did not work? And so, you know, it depends on what you define as the objectives of the initiative. In our view, it was a success in the sense that it gave many of the HIPC countries that benefited from debt relief a fresh start and enabled them to, in effect, undergo a development push in the subsequent decade. And it is that development push that in some cases made them the victims of their success, because many countries, particularly in Africa, have graduated not only, but also as a result of preceding HIPC debt relief to a state where they can now borrow from markets. And history, time and time again, it tells us that when this is the case, countries tend to overborrow. Now, having said that, there is more, I think, than a cyclical element to this story. So I think that, you know, first of all, not all of the so-called frontier economies are in trouble now. They are all under stress, but many of them may avoid restructuring. Second, there is a sense that the market access of that country, of those countries, is a structural feature that will be there even after this crisis is over. So basically, in that sense, I think HIPC, while not being the only factor, contributed to a development leap. And the fact that countries can borrow from markets and in many cases overborrow are the unintended and unfortunate consequences of that development leap, but they do not invalidate the positive consequences of the same leap.
Alfonso, you want to add something?
No, very briefly, Rosa. I fully agree with what Jeremy has just mentioned, and I think that the key answer to that question is how do we? I mean, what is being successful? I mean, how do we define the successfulness of this initiative? And I agree with Jeremy that there are some countries that actually were successful, and even after the years, the path that they have been able to follow, probably thanks among many other things to that, is there. Whereas there are others that have actually come back to a difficult situation. So I don't think that we should find or try to find a causality or a clear correlation between one thing and the other, and also the counterfactual is always there. No? If this would not have happened, what would have been the development path of these countries? No? So I think that we should take a little bit more of a distance when thinking on a specific causality there. And yes, I agree with Jeremy. The objective was very clear, and the objective was achieved. That some of these countries ended up in a difficult situation again some years later. Yes, that's also true. But this is something that is the prerogative of every country after some years.
Thank you very much. The next question is addressed to all panelists. So what you can do if anyone wants to answer is just physically raise the hand. And is with China being a large direct lender to many emerging economies, how will, sorry, one second. How will their geopolitical and economic role change through this upcoming sovereign debt crisis? So who wants to talk about China as a creditor nation to many of these nations? Raise your hand. Anyone wants to answer this question, which is addressed to all the panelists? Anna. You unmute yourself, yeah?
I did, and hopefully the sound will work. So I am not, I don't have a huge comparative advantage on this, but I do think we should focus on this question, because I think this is the opportunity for China to take a more active role, to take a leadership in a debt restructuring architecture that's in flux, right? So one of the positive things about the G20 communique on that launched DSSI was that G20 communique with China on it. Problem is, if this thing fails, as many people say, then it does not help the project of bringing China into the debt restructuring architecture, and having it take ownership of the institutional framework, which I think it should, given its size, right? It's not, the size no longer allows for free riding or side deals.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anybody else? Rodrigo, you want to add something? Yes, you can unmute yourself. Rodrigo?
Yes.
Yeah.
Rosa, just to add to what Anna was saying, just a quick line. In the last couple of days, there was a white paper published by the China State Council, where they are saying that they have suspended their repayments from 77 developing countries after acting upon the debt service suspension initiative of the G20. This was an announcement which is very recent, so I would like to see how this plays out, but it was just adding that piece of information to complement the current status quo, what's the role and what will happen with China. This is a very recent announcement, and it comes through a white paper, so we will have to see how that plays out.
Okay, thank you very much. The next questions go to Sean, and they are 3 questions relating to the IMF, Sean. And one comes from Hector Rogelio Tortes, and he writes, what's the advantage of partial debt restructuring? Could the IMF conclude that the debt is sustainable if the sovereign is in partial default? And of course, if you want to answer going back to default, you are also very welcome to do so. And then Brett House answers, can the IMF issue debt under its articles? And I think it's article 7 or 8. What are the constraints, if any? And he gives context. IMF arguably has too little firepower. Above 90 countries have already come to ask for assistance post-COVID. And there has been discussion about a new SDR allocation that went nowhere. Would that help boost FX reserves for some emerging markets? It wouldn't make a big impact on the fund size. Some have raised the prospect of IMF issuing debt in capital markets to boost its firepower similar to the World Bank. And the last question, just to group the questions to you, relates to the, and Lee can come in also too, relates to the article that you published with Lee in Alpha Bill in the Financial Times, From Coronavirus Crisis to Sovereign Debt Crisis, where you talk about the sovereign immunities laws in the US and in the UK that could be amended to permit judges to have lawsuits against countries whereby the IMF certifies the normal debt service is impossible in light of the current crisis, and you define it as an international equivalent of a temporary moratorium on mortgage foreclosures. So if you want just briefly to answer to these 3 questions, and obviously anybody in the room, Anna on partial default, Lee on the article can jump in. So Sean, first the floor is yours if you want to unmute yourself.
Sure, thank you, Rosa. So on the first question, as to whether or not debt sustainability can be addressed by restructuring a portion of the debt stock rather than the full amount, the answer is absolutely yes. And I think this raises a more general conceptual issue, which is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that while we have general criteria like debt sustainability that guide decisions, the application of those general criteria does require, case-by-case application. And in some cases, it may make sense that a portion of the sovereign debt is not restructured because it actually may create more problems than it's worth. And some creditors may go along with that. Excluding a portion of the debt may give rise to intercreditor equity problems, and you might have a hard time getting creditors who are being restructured going ahead unless they see other creditors being treated similarly. But from an analytical perspective, there's no reason why debt sustainability has to be addressed by having the entire debt stock restructured. Yes, the fund has the legal capacity to borrow under Article 7 of its articles, and it has used that power extensively, both by borrowing bilaterally, but also through the new agreements to borrow, which now constitute a major source of its financing. Yes, it is possible for the fund also to raise financing on the capital markets. It has never done so. It would create a number of issues that would need to be addressed. I would argue that, at least in my view, the real issue is not so much at this stage the firepower of the fund, but rather this particularly difficult issue that we're addressing today, which is to what extent should the fund use its firepower without a debt restructuring. And I think that's because remember, the debt restructuring does provide some of the financing that would otherwise come from the fund. The final question is the reference to Lee in my article in the FT. I mean, look, we haven't talked about this, but clearly one of the questions that arises if this crisis does become systemic is, do we have the right carrots and sticks in place to basically ensure that we are able to have restructurings that attract broad participation? In the Brady crisis and the Brady plan, we had some carrots that were provided, including collateralized debt obligations that involved resources from the IMF that were sweeteners, and also resources from the World Bank. But on the stick side, there was not so much of a concern because, as Lee has pointed out, much of the debt was held by commercial banks who were more obliging. In an environment where a lot of the debt is held by bondholders who can, as we have seen, take aggressive action, and where we have a systemic level of debt restructuring, the question is, do we have the instruments needed? Now, we do have the CACs, and those have been discussed today. The problem is, only 50% of the existing debt stock has the aggregated CACs that have just been referred to, and I am also somewhat concerned about what's going on in Argentina as to whether or not that whole process may take those CACs. But I think there is a question as to whether or not we may need to have more robust types of measures that would constrain holdout behavior. And Lee and I floated a couple of ideas which actually have been relied upon to a certain extent. I mean, the example that I come to mind most is in Iraq, which where Lee was actively involved, which was where the Chapter 7 of the UN Security Charter was used by the Council to basically constrain the ability of creditors to attach assets of Iraq. That was supported by an executive order in the United States that basically implemented that. Now, do we have an environment where something multilateral like that could be put in place? The advantage of Chapter 7 is that, unlike the SDRM, you don't have to create it. It's there. You just have to basically get an affirmative vote in the Security Council. The problem is you may not get that vote. So the question is there anything else that can be done? And I think the point that Lee and I were making is that most of this debt, the legal domicile is New York or England. And therefore, you could look at just the laws or executive action in those two jurisdictions as a way of constraining debtor behavior. Look, there hasn't been a strong appetite for doing this. Generally, the emphasis is on contractual reform. I just think the question is, are contracts up to the job if we really do have a systemic crisis?
Lee, if you want to add something on that and also perhaps something on a possible legislative approach.
Sure. First, I agree with all that Sean has just said, but let me point out one potential problem. We hope we are justified in relying on collective action clauses to facilitate sovereign debt workouts. But what would happen if creditors decided that they wish to move quickly to obtain court judgments in the hopes that by elevating themselves to the status of judgment creditor, they would thereby escape the collective action clause in their underlying bonds? This is an open question, at least under New York law, whether a collective action clause would retain some vitality and be applicable even to a judgment creditor. But we are seeing this phenomenon play out in Venezuela right now, where I serve as an advisor to the Guaido government. But creditors are pursuing, bond creditors are pursuing judgments And if they get them before a restructuring can be launched, would they escape the purview of the collective action mechanism and their underlying bonds upon which we are all relying to facilitate the coming process? In Venezuela's case, of course, a debt restructuring simply cannot be launched because of the sanctions imposed by the US government at the moment. And so this opens up an opportunity for someone potentially to exploit this situation. In the article that Sean and I published, we were recommending that courts use their inherent power to stay litigation. Certainly in a crisis such as this one, I would have thought that the moral justification for that stay would be self-evident. So, I'll stop there, Rosa.
Thank you very much. The next question, which has been standing for some time, is by Mark Sobel. And I will address this to Mark, but anyone can also answer. The question, which you can read in the chat room, is, what can your group do to protect the ICMA CACs as part of the Argentine creditor negotiations? Also, and perhaps you or someone else, who can provide a detailed discussion of where China stands with the debt service suspension initiative, or SEXIM and CDB participating? Is there concrete data and transparency, or state-owned enterprises, SOCB lending included? So, Mark, a long question for you by Mark Sobel, and you can answer either to the first part and to the second, or to both.
Well, let me say a little bit about the first part, although I suspect that some other folks on the panel will have more and better responses than I will. Without talking specifically about what the Sovereign Debt Forum can do, I think it's worth emphasizing at least the amount of work that went in to the creation of the new ICMA CACs and the amount of suasion that was required to get those clauses to be widely accepted in the market. And they have been widely accepted. The vast majority of international bonds, at least under New York and English law, have embraced the new CACs. And we are, in some ways, in our first test case about how well they're going to work in facilitating a restructuring, although, of course, Argentina is a hybrid case. The intent of the clause, as I understand it from my relatively peripheral perch, was to smooth out some of the coordination difficulties that were present in having to conduct a series-by-series vote. And those coordination difficulties, especially given the fact that some series of bonds were small enough and therefore easy to buy blocking stakes in, those coordination difficulties were perceived to be a real sand in the wheels of a restructuring. So the intent was to grease the wheels in that sense, if you will. At the same time, there was a, to my mind, kind of inchoate fear that many creditors had that once you allow pooled voting and once you give the sovereign the discretion over the pool, you're creating all kinds of opportunity for opportunistic behavior, vote rigging, to sort of be blunt about it. It's not possible to write a contract that perfectly balances those two objectives, for the simple reason that you can't anticipate and draft around all of the clever things that a sovereign might do to try to exploit gaps in the contracts. That means a fair amount of good faith is required in the use of the contracts. I haven't made up my mind yet about whether the Argentine proposal satisfies that expectation, but it would be a shame if the result of this fairly contentious negotiation was to chop the legs out from under the primary contract innovation of the last, in some respects, 20 years before we get a sense of whether it works.
Thank you very much. On the China question, and also I want to add another question so that some of the other panelists can contribute. Alfonso pointed out the doom loop, the vicious link between sovereign debt and commercial banks, which was a defining feature of the Eurozone crisis. How widespread is the problem at the moment? And perhaps, Jerome, I will ask you that question. And if you want to also answer to the China question, you're most welcome. And then the other question, just to bring two questions, and then other panelists can jump in. Is the holdout problem in the 2020s more acute or less acute than in the past? And did the end of the Argentina's holdout saga in 2016 encourage future holdouts? So quite a few things, but if you want to start, perhaps, Jerome, to talk about this doom loop, which is always a major concern in the feeding, in the vicious circle feeding of a sovereign debt / banking crisis.
Okay, so let's start with the doom loop. So the doom loop is always a concern in countries where banking systems hold sovereign debt. But if you like, there's a standard doom loop, and then where the causality is from the sovereign to the banks, and this has always been the case. So you have typically, fairly large exposures, particularly pre-crisis and the run-up to a crisis of banks to their sovereigns, because banks are a form of digesting the rollover shock that typically precipitates a crisis. And then there's a restructuring, and the idea of a restructuring is that you gain sufficient fiscal space that then enables you to recapitalize the banks. So that is sort of the standard thing that always happens, and will happen now in many cases, and so the present is no different from the past. Then you have the Euro area style crisis style doom loop, where we had several countries. The two most famous cases were Ireland and Spain, also Cyprus, where banking system issues infected sovereigns that were otherwise in very good shape or in reasonably good shape. So that problem we are seeing far less in this crisis than in the last one, because this crisis is not triggered by banking system issues primarily, and because we have much better safety nets in Europe to deal with it. So in that sense, I would say the doom loop is less of an issue than it certainly was in the Euro area crisis. On Mark Sobel's China question, so I guess the gist of Mark's response is China participating? Not, is it fully participating? And so the answer is China is participating. The white paper that Rodrigo mentioned is a welcome sign of a political commitment to participate, though we do not interpret this as actually 77 countries having received debt relief at this point, but as a willingness to provide it. So that would include the DSSI countries in our interpretation. And then whether specific Chinese lending agencies will participate in what form, to what extent, that is still somewhat unclear, but we hope it will be clarified soon.
Anna, you want to add something?
Sure, just a couple of things. On the export credit agencies, it's a really interesting dynamic. So the G20 communique didn't address that point, but the G7 communique just a week ago did. But of course, the G7 doesn't include China, so query what shift from then to now mean, and to what extent might it exert pull on China to join the fray or lead the fray. On some of the broader questions, it's really fascinating to see, as I think Mark highlighted, there are all these unsettled questions in this ecosystem that are exposed in this generalized crisis, right? So for example, the role of export credit agencies and how exactly do they participate in restructurings? Everything was about the Paris Club. In some sense, the question of transparency didn't come up because most of the relevant players could get together in the same room. Well, right now we have all this pressure for debt transparency, and I've seen some questions about confidentiality clauses in China's contracts, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it is not like anybody else ever a model of debt transparency, right? It is just that now we have this incredibly heterogeneous creditor and debtor population where some of the festering problems, or some of the dormant issues are coming to a head. Ditto with CACs. I think that if countries and creditors decide to go back on the ICMA CACs, what you're going to see is more pressure for statutory sovereign bankruptcy, maybe for the good, but I don't think that's the intent. As for the doom loop, I guess this is one of the few things that actually is an improvement over the 1980s. I keep thinking back to 1982, when if 17 of the most indebted countries had defaulted, the entire US banking system would be insolvent, like 130% of US bank capital, right? Whatever the problem is now, that's not a world we live in. So, ending on a high note.
Thank you very much. Alfonso wanted to add something on this sovereign banking doom loop.
Yes, thank you, Rosa. Yes, very quickly, because maybe I'm a little bit more concerned about the potential second round effects of this crisis. So I fully agree with, there are two ways in which we can see the nexus. No? One is banks buying sovereign debt, and therefore this is the typical way in which a sovereign crisis can affect the banking sector and enter into a negative loop. But the second one, as Jeremy mentioned, is what happened in the euro area and what can happen in many countries, especially in those where the financial sector is not so strong. And there are many in emerging and developing countries where the financial sector is not so sound to absorb what could come. And what I am referring to is that the deterioration of assets, corporate assets, that we are seeing as a result of COVID-19 will be very, very serious in many countries that do not have the insolvency frameworks, that do not have out-of-court resolution mechanisms, that will have significant problems in order to manage this deterioration of assets. These can bring back, or can come back to the balance sheets of the banking sector, and at the end of the day, could come to the sovereign. And therefore having this negative loop that we saw in the euro area that could be replicated in many other countries in the developing world. So I think that this is an angle that we are not there yet, because I think that this part of the impact of this crisis has not been materialized yet, but could also have a significant impact on the sustainability on many countries that could come across or down the road. No? So I think that we need to keep an eye there, because this could really have a significant impact in some countries that were already vulnerable before entering into the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you very much. And then, Lee, would you like to add something on the holdout problem? Is it better, worse, the same? What was the impact of the Argentine litigation? We cannot hear you, Lee.
Thank you, Rosa. We did not have a significant holdout creditor problem in the 1980s and early 1990s, largely because the creditor universe at the time was homogeneous. It was commercial banks and a combination of peer pressure from fellow bankers, or failing that, regulatory pressure from the bank's regulators kept most of them in line during that decade. When we moved in the 1990s to having the bond markets be the principal source of private finance to emerging market countries, we faced a much more serious holdout creditor problem. The innovation, not innovation, but technique that is most effective in dealing with that problem was the use of trust structures. And those countries that, in my view, were wise enough to shift from fiscal agency agreements to trust indentures or trust deeds face a much less serious holdout creditor problem, simply because the enforcement power for the bond, certainly for accelerated amounts under a bond, is centralized in the hands of the trustee, and the trustee, when it sues or enforces the bond, does so on behalf of all holders rateably. So you take away the smash and grab motivation that a fiscal agency agreement will provide to certain creditors, that immediately upon a default, they're the first in the courthouse, they're the first to get a judgment, and they hope they are the first to extract a preferential recovery. Trust structures significantly, not completely, but significantly moderate that motivation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lee. And Rodrigo wanted to add something on that. Rodrigo, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Just to add on the holdout question, is basically, I think that the problem now has been reduced. I think that basically with the enhanced CACs, with the streamlined pari passu clauses, and that was another question that came out in the chat at some point, whether we were going to have another, whether Loretta Bresca we will have a second round on the interpretation of the pari passu clause. I think that no, because what we had before was a unique situation with a lock law. So I don't think that we will see a second round of that. On top of that, I think that the Second Circuit was very clear when they basically put the lid on the open Pandora's box. So I think that basically the market sector has worked in streamlining and perfecting the contracts. On top of that, we are seeing, and this is something that, if I'm not mistaken, it was Jeremy on his opening remarks that noted that basically we are starting to see a change in the composition of the creditor side, which I think that will also facilitate the restructurings and minimize the chances for holdout creditors. So on that question about whether we see or we can see a holdout problem, and also going to one of which I think basically was one of the main takeaways that Lee mentioned in his opening remark when he was saying that basically countries are better prepared now. So basically, I think that it's a combination between what we have learned in the last, let's say, 20 years, that I think that we have better contracts, we have greater know-how, and also I think that to an extent the 15 years of litigation, or the 15 years of litigation in Argentina in the previous restructuring has also left some important lessons for both sides.
Thank you very much. And with that remark on Argentina, Argentina first, Argentina last.
No,
we're going to...
Rosa, it was a remark on debt restructuring. Argentina.
No. Whenever I see, I think Argentina. Anyway, Rodrigo, you know, I say it with great frenzy for the country and for you as a citizen of that country. I will, just before I finish, like to reiterate that as the World Bank President David Malpass reiterated this weekend, that the coronavirus pandemic is really a devastating blow for the world economy, and particularly for the countries which are the main cause of our sovereign debt forum. Billions of people will have their livelihoods affected by the pandemic. 60 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty. Many children in the developing world will miss out on education, and the economic fallout could last for a decade. These are all conditions that suggest that they're quite systemic, whether or not we end up with a systemic sovereign debt crisis. And the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, had said that this is a global crisis like no other. And the thing is that we have not seen yet the end of it. And there are many elements of uncertainty which are still on the table. So with that thought, which is not perhaps a very optimistic one, but it's certainly realistic, I would like again to thank our incredibly insightful and distinguished panelists. This is the who is who in sovereign debt. I was delighted to be the host of such a panel. And my last word for those of you that missed the beginning is that we will continue at the Sovereign Debt Forum, which again I reiterate is a collaboration between the Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London and the Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown University, as well as now the European University Institute. We will continue to look at these issues that affect the destiny of low and middle income countries with regard to their potential sovereign debt distress, but also other broader issues like the ones we have discussed in today's panel. I would also like to thank our attendees that many of their questions we couldn't really address. There was no time, but it just shows the amount of interest that this panel has triggered, that there are many unanswered questions. Of course, we collectively and individually will remain available to answer via email or to get in touch with any of our attendees, thanking them very much. And just keep a looking for our website. You have the website in the invitation, and we will have further events, training, seminars, and other sessions and panels like we have today. And then the final thank goes for everyone that has helped us, Marcelo, Marie, Meja, to make the event today possible. I think that notwithstanding the difficulties of living in Zoom land, we have connected continents and time zones, and despite some barriers of sound, we have managed to deal with very important issues in a way that has been useful for both the panelists and the attendees. So thank you very much to everyone. Allow me to clap virtually all the panelists. And with that, I will leave now the room and invite everyone else to say goodbye and leave.